The brain is a complex and fascinating organ. Like the rest of the body, the brain can be positively and negatively affected by the environment, especially by the neighborhoods in which we live. Today we'll learn how community violence affects brain function in children. Before we begin looking at different parts of the brain, we first need to define community violence and ask ourselves, just how significant of an issue is it? Community violence is violence perpetrated by people outside of one's immediate family. This is violence that occurs on the streets and in alleys, on the basketball courts and playgrounds, and on the walk to school and at school. In fact, children growing up in high poverty, high crime neighborhoods say that school is one of the places where they feel most unsafe. Community violence also includes bullying, fights among gangs, being chased, being robbed, shootings in public areas, and stabbings. For children living in high poverty, high crime neighborhoods, the likelihood of experiencing these types of violence is common. Children from such neighborhoods are more likely to be bullied at school, witness violence in their neighborhood, and at home. Their parents might not be able to help them because they might be a part of the problem or have been exposed to the same types of violence themselves. Witnessing community violence can create a feedback loop of increasing violence. Witnessing violence causes stress, anxiety, and fear, and leaves children with the feeling that they can't count on adults to keep them safe. Children who lose their sense of safety may resort to carrying weapons and being overly aggressive to protect themselves from other youth and adults. This can escalate to bigger and more serious acts of violence. Exposure to community violence has been described as a public health epidemic for children. Between 20% and 50% of children in the U.S. are victims of violence within their homes, at their school, and in their communities. Exposure to violence is particularly high for children residing in economically disadvantaged urban neighborhoods. It is rare in urban elementary schools to find children who have not been exposed to such negative events. One study found that between 75% and 80% of low-income African American youth witness community violence ranging from assault to murder. For too many children, these violent acts have become ordinary everyday events. Before moving forward, let's dispel 3 common myths about community violence. Myth number 1, infants can't be traumatized. Infants and toddlers can experience lasting effects of fear as early as 6 months old. Infants who witness violence in their homes or community show excessive irritability, immature behavior, sleep disturbances, emotional distress, fear of being alone, and regression in toileting and language. This means that no child is too young to be developmentally harmed by living in a high crime and high violence neighborhood. Myth number 2, people become desensitized to violence after repeated exposure to violence. One study that looked at the effects of community violence on African American youth showed an increase in symptoms of depression as exposure to violence increased. As violence exposure levels peaked, depressive symptoms appeared to decrease. Researchers believe that the youth were actively suppressing their depressive symptoms in order to seem tough and avoid being targeted for further harassment or violence. Myth number 3, the effects of exposure to community violence can be easily overcome. Traumatizing experiences can have significant long-term effects on children's brain development. These stress-induced changes to the cognitive, emotional, and behavioral functioning of children can be seen as early as 1 year old. These changes do not simply get better with time, but require active unlearning and the development of new cognitive capacities later in life. Now let's go back to the brain we saw earlier. Exposure to community violence causes toxic stress. Toxic stress, unlike everyday stress or positive stress, triggers strong, frequent, and prolonged activation of the body's stress response system. The hippocampus is central to learning and memory. Individuals who are exposed to toxic stress as children may have a smaller hippocampus, making it hard for them to remember what they studied for their test. Those who have been exposed to toxic stress also tend to have a smaller corpus callosum, which is responsible for communication between the 2 sides of the brain and processes like arousal, emotion, and higher cognitive abilities. The size of the cerebellum, which helps to coordinate motor behavior and executive functioning, has also been shown to decrease due to exposure to toxic stress. Also, some research shows that children who were severely neglected tend to have a smaller prefrontal cortex, an area which is critical to self-control and regulating behavior, cognition, and emotion. Abuse and neglect can cause overactivity in the amygdala. This can cause a child to have trouble determining if an interaction is threatening and result in often overly emotional responses. For example, this can lead to children overreacting to being bumped in the hallway by a peer. Children exposed to chronic violence also have abnormal cortisol levels. Cortisol is the body's primary stress hormone that puts the brain and body into a state of alarm so that it can fight off threats. When children's bodies and brains are repeatedly flooded with cortisol, they can be put into a constant state of alarm. Okay, so what can be done to help children that have been exposed to community violence? How can schools help to create positive environments to support students who are put at risk due to victimization, trauma, and threatening environments? To answer this question, let's head back to the school we saw earlier. Schools can play a key role in providing the supports that these students need. Rather than targeting a few students who exhibit highly disruptive behavior in the classroom, schools should implement a school-wide support system to help students who have experienced violence learn how to regulate their cognition, emotions, and social interactions so that they are able to participate more fully. Here are 4 things that schools can do. 1. Create safe spaces. Children living in high violence areas can benefit from having a protected place in the neighborhood. Such safe havens can shield children from exposure to violence and can aid in their resilience. By doing so, schools provide opportunities for children to benefit from the support of their peers, which has been shown to be critical in reducing anxiety among children exposed to violence. 2. Form deeper relationships with students. Student-teacher relationships have been found to be the key predictor of decreased at-risk behavior. Specifically, relationships that are teacher-driven, authentic, caring, and attuned to the emotional needs of individual students. Noticing absences, telling students they were missed, knowing their names, saying hi in the hall, and active listening were identified as the small things that made the biggest difference. Caring and positive relationships with teachers are also important for a child's sense of safety. 3. Limit the use of exclusionary discipline like suspension and expulsion. Exclusionary discipline is used disproportionately with racial and ethnic minority students and low-income students and increases the probability of long-term negative outcomes like involvement in the juvenile justice system. Although exclusionary discipline practices are not a direct path to juvenile justice system involvement, it negatively affects students' attitude towards school, causing them to become disengaged and perhaps begin to skip classes. Alternative approaches should focus on finding out why the student is acting out and also focus on reintegrating students after an incident of disruptive classroom behavior. 4. Engage parents. Research has shown that family support is critical in helping decrease the effects of violence. Because many parents in high poverty, high crime neighborhoods have experienced the same types of community violence as their children, it is important for parents to have the opportunity to talk about their own feelings and trauma. After working through their own problems, parents will be more able to help their children. Schools can also act as a platform to get parents involved in their children's lives through teacher conferences, game nights, open houses, and other community events. Policymakers also play a key role in meeting students' needs. Child welfare policies and programs are important for preventing exposure to traumatic experiences. Ensuring that schools have the funding for mental health supports is critical. This enables early identification and treatment for anxiety and post-traumatic stress disorders by the school social worker. Early identification decreases the likelihood of a lifetime of poor mental and physical health, diminished economic productivity, and antisocial behavior. Finally, it is vital to have continued funding for teacher professional development aimed at increasing their competency with trauma-responsive educational practices. Exposure to violence changes the physical structure of children's brains, and this has negative effects on their development. But there is good news. With early identification and use of trauma-responsive educational practices, the effects of violence can be managed. Remember, children as young as 6 months can experience fear. Children do not get desensitized to repeated acts of violence, and the effects of exposure to violence are not easily overcome. With time, patience, and active intervention, the negative effects of exposure to community violence can be undone. Positive growth can be fostered, and ultimately, children can grow into healthy and productive adults.